Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. The Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. Now, a big reason why I started Redeeming Babel and have continued the podcast is I really feel passionately about this mission of helping Christians make sense of the world, especially the parts of the world that they tend to leave the world to make sense of for them and not their life of following Jesus. And I think there's ways in which we as Christians can really, kind of open up parts of our lives to Jesus, our prayer life, our relationships, our marriages, and so forth. But other parts of our life, we just unquestioningly let the world make sense of it for us. And I believe one of those areas is the activity of investing. Investing in the stock market, for instance, is a primary way that Christians actually engage with the world. If you step back and look at all of America, the latest statistics show that something like 61% of Americans have money invested in the stock market, either directly through stocks or through a mutual fund, an index fund, or something like that. So 61% of Americans, my guess is among the listeners of this Good Faith podcast, that's probably more like over 90% of our listeners have some part of your wealth, your money invested in the stock market. But that's a massive amount of money. I mean, the total amount of money invested in the stock market is, I think I looked it up, was like something like $91 trillion. So you think about the Christian share of that, that's a huge amount of money. And yet, if you actually looked at the investment practices, at the investment holdings, if you looked at the portfolios of Christians and their investments, and you compared it with the average portfolio and practices of most non-Christians, I would hazard to say that you're, on average, not going to see actually that much difference at all, that the investment practices are going to look very similar on average between Christians and non-Christians. Is that okay? I mean, is investing kind of similar to breathing or drinking or cooking, where, well, of course, we're all human beings. We all do it the same way, regardless of our faith commitments or not. Or does a commitment to follow Jesus with our heart, soul, and mind, with everything we have, does that actually affect how we practice investing in the world as well? And to help us answer that question, I'm so excited to have two guests join us, Robin, John, and Finny Kuruvilla, who are founders of an investment firm called Eventide Investments. So Finny and Robin, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
It's great to be with you, Curtis.
Yeah, thank you, Curtis.
So why have I invited Finny and Robin on? Well, when I was researching this question for my own personal life, for our own family investments, for our retirement and so forth, I started asking this question. Should my life as a disciple of Jesus, should it really be more influential on my investment practices? Because as I applied that question I asked of evaluation, I came to the conclusion, my investment practices don't look that different from any of my non-Christian neighbors. And I was asking around, and I believe it was Andy Crouch, who has been a frequent guest on this podcast and also knows these guys, Finny and Robin. Andy directed me towards Eventide Investments. So I went on their website, and immediately their tagline jumped on it. The tagline to Eventide Investments is investing that makes the world rejoice. And that's when I'm like, wait, what's going on here? And by the way, full disclosure, I don't know if there's an SEC regulation or something like that. I ended up choosing to invest in Eventide because I was so intrigued by that tagline, investing that makes the world rejoice. So, Finny, let me start with you. What does that tagline mean? Why did you guys choose it as your slogan?
Yeah, so it comes from a verse in the book of Proverbs that says, when the righteous prospers, the city rejoices. And it's supposed to be the case that when God's people, when the righteous are prospering financially, that's supposed to overflow into blessing the communities, the cities, the countries that they are a part of. And so we decided to use that verse and adapt it somewhat into the context of investing to say that our investing should be something, because it's the overflow of what you don't probably need that day or that month, that ought to be something that redounds into the blessing of one's own city. So yeah, that was the origin of that tagline.
I love it. So we're going to dive into just how Eventide practices an investment philosophy. But Robin, give an overview of what Eventide is. Even like, what does it do? How does it? How do people relate to Eventide? Who are you? What do you? Give us a sense of the scale. Like, give us the big picture of Eventide.
Yeah, I think our purpose statement sums it up pretty well. Eventide strives to honor God and serve its clients by investing in companies that create compelling value for the global common good. So, what we're seeking to pursue is what we call values based investing rooted in a biblical worldview. So, as Finney said, investing that makes the world rejoice. We want to invest in companies that are promoting human flourishing and the global common good. And ultimately, we do that through a framework that we call avoid, embrace, engage. So we want to avoid investing in what Proverbs 1 will call ill-gotten gain or plunder. And we want to pursue investing in companies that are really loving their neighbors, their stakeholders, including customers and employees and others. And we also want to keep engaging with these companies to be even better in terms of serving the needs of the world.
So, and you do this essentially Eventide from a sort of category definition. You guys are a mutual fund. Was that the best way to think of it? And that basically any investor with a certain level of money, which you can explain what that is, can actually invest in your philosophy and approach to the world. Is that correct, Robin?
Yes, that's right. So we started as a mutual fund company, but ultimately we are an investment advisory firm that provides what we call Business 360, which is our approach to investing. And mutual funds is where we started because we wanted to be able to serve the everyday person. But at this point, we have separate accounts. We have a private biotech fund. So there are other products at Eventide today.
Okay. Well, we'll get into that. But Finney, I want to ask you, this philosophy of making the world rejoice, of avoiding and embracing, promoting the common good, how different is this than the standard world's practice, the broader world's practice towards investing? Is this really different? Is this really divergent from what everybody else is doing?
Yeah. So let me begin to answer that question first by laying out some groundwork here in terms of how to think about this. We began Eventide from a Christian worldview, from a faith-based perspective, and one of the key notions of what the market represents is that every person is expressing something when you're investing. You're expressing something about what you want, what kind of time horizon. There's in a sense a marketplace of ideas that's happening in the marketplace of businesses, and that expression of your dollars is a statement of one's values. So there's a lot of people who will just say, just buy the whole market and don't worry about trying to pick specific companies or filter certain companies out or select companies in. And that's a particular value set that says that. There's another set of values that thinks more carefully about the role of impact. And so how do people who steward capital, how do we shape the world around us? And this is something that is very important historically in the Christian faith, is thinking about how we as stewards of capital can influence the world around us for good or for bad. So we can give more examples as the podcast goes on here, but that's a very important concept because you've heard that saying, the pen is mightier than the sword. Well, the dollar is even mightier than the pen. There's right. Something about money that is very, very shaping to the world that we live in. And I think that's pretty widely recognized. So there's, on the one hand, this expression of values that someone does when they're coming into investing. And we would say that those values should be the same values that you express on Sunday when you're in whatever church a person happens to be a part of, in your small groups, in your families. There ought to be a coherence of your value set there, and there shouldn't be some kind of artificial partitioning between one's values in the market and one's values, say, in the church. So that's one. There's a second dimension too of understanding here what's going on in investing, which is that the businesses also shape us, and businesses are I would make the case are some of the most powerfully formative institutions or forces, period, in our discipleship. So think about the clothes you wear, the music you listen to, the shows you watch,
Right.
The cars you drive, what you think is funny, what you think is not funny. I mean, almost all of that is shaped significantly, if not in the majority, by the businesses that you are patronizing. So we can multiply examples here, but it is a huge element of what forms the church and what forms a given disciple. And I actually think this is a major blind spot that the church has had for a long time, which is thinking more deeply about what is the role of the business environment and corporations in general on forming our sensibilities and our beliefs about everything from God's character to sexuality to how to relate to refugees, you name it. It's tremendously shaped by these institutions. And so we as investors have the ability to shape companies. So there's all kinds of voting mechanisms and shareholder resolutions. There's a lot of different mechanisms that are built into the market by which an investor ought to be shaping what he or she owns. And so this in general is an underutilized source of leverage in the world today. So if somebody is, say, a Christian and they're investing identically to their secular peers, well, not surprisingly, the value sets that are being expressed are going to be the same because they're operating in the same ways to actually change those companies. And in some sense, the powers that be, the businesses that be, they want to reinforce status quo. And so something like the default way of investing is going to support status quo as we know it. And so this bidirectional flow of force, us on the companies and the companies on us, is right at the heart of what we ought to be doing when we think about investing and business. And as I said, I think this is one of the most important areas of discipleship that we hardly think about, which, again, I'd love to unpack as we go on here.
Yeah. All right, but though that sounds wonderful, it also sounds a little abstract, Finny. So Robin, flesh this out. How does Eventide do this? How does Eventide actually create a different value set that Christians are expressing and also being exposed to? What are you guys investing in that reflects a set of Christian values in this exchange of formation?
Yeah, so for us, the first step was really understanding what Christian values are. So Finny and I spent, along with a few others, 6 months prior to starting Eventide, fasting and praying. We would do that once a week for 6 months, and we would meet in Finny's house and pray together. And ultimately, we decided that the Bible, Romans 12 talks about not conforming to the patterns of the world, but being transformed by the renewing of our minds. So part of what we had to wrestle with is really asking ourselves, what is the world's stories that we have bought into? The story that the world tells us about business and investing.
Wow.
Many Christians have just bought into it. So how do we think about a biblical framework? And what are these beyond just values? When we think about a framework for investing, we ultimately decided that even in Genesis 1, God is a creator who calls good what he creates. Then the Bible says God created us in his image, in his likeness. It basically says so that we could have dominion, right? So what does all that mean? Then the greatest commandment, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So how do we bring that into this framework? Paul in Galatians says that all the commandments are summed up in that one commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. We read that the love your neighbor principle is the royal law of Scripture. So that's why at Eventide, we honor God by seeking to love our neighbors through investing. So that's the framework, is loving neighbors through investing. And so, putting that all together, I mentioned the avoid, embrace, engage. So we had to understand what are the things we're going to avoid investing in. Like, what are the things that are plundering and creating harm in the world? Things like abortion, pornography, tobacco, weaponry, violent video gaming, environmental harm, um, gambling. There's a whole list of things that we said we're going to avoid investing in. And then we had to determine, okay, what are the things that we want to lean into in terms of human flourishing? Ultimately, every industry is different, and we want to find the best examples in the given industry in terms of value creation. Avoid value extraction, lean into value creation. So an example of this would be like a trucking company that we're investing in that really focuses on having their drivers sleep in their own beds every night. That's an example of how that company is seeking to create value and love their employees. The company also does a wonderful job in terms of on-time delivery rates and things like that. So they're serving their customers well, loving their employees well. So we're looking for companies like that within the given industry. So the neighbors we're looking at are customers, employees, supply chains, host communities, environment, and society.
Got it. Well, let's break that down a little more. Finny, Robbins laid out the avoid part of the framework. Avoid doing harm, avoid plundering the world. In what ways does the standard world practices of investing actually lead people to fund exploitation? And how does your investment avoid those things? Like, give me some examples of where, if I'm investing, if I'm just putting my money in a S&P 500 index fund, right? I could say, well, look, I'm not actively investing in exploitation or plunder. I think you guys would say, no, actually, you may be unthinkingly participating in this. Break that down for me. Like, why do I need to be more conscious than just giving my money to whatever is giving me the best returns in the market? Why is that important to avoiding plunder and harm?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons there. So the first is simply an ethical and theological principle, which is that we don't want to be profiting from activities that are dishonoring God and harming our neighbor. There's a lot of passages and scriptures that speak to this. There's one in particular that is from the book of Deuteronomy, where it says, "Do not bring the earnings of a prostitute into the temple, for it's an abomination to me." And God says, okay, if you have some kind of earnings from prostitution here, I don't want to have that come into my temple. You don't, quote, baptize those monies, those profits, simply by donating it away. And so there is a precedent for this. There's other examples that we could speak to here, but in general, there's a very firm principle here that you don't want to be profiting from harm.
Okay, but let me interrupt you here for a second. But Finny, apply that principle to the world's practice of investment. What stock listing is listing as we're prostitute, PRO, prostitutes as our stock ticker symbol? What is that, and how is that part of the world's practice of investing?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example here, maybe without naming the specific company, but it's we actually wrote a piece about this several years ago that is in probably a lot of the percentage, I'm going to guess 20-30% of the people who would have any kind of investments would be owning this company. It's a tobacco company, and we ran a piece that I thought was very, very interesting. It began by talking about a boy whose name is Hadi, who lives in Indonesia. And the story is fascinating because this boy is 8 years old, and we open up by telling a true story about how he was stealing money from his parents and from other people in order to fund his habit. What's interesting is that this little boy, this 8-year-old boy, started smoking at 4 years old. And you might say, okay, that's some crazy anomaly. Well, as it turns out, it's not at all. The whole industry of tobacco is highly regulated in the US. It's not so regulated when you go into the developing world. And the average age for starting to smoke in Indonesia has fallen from 19 years old to 7 years old. And yes, wow. I said 7. So wow. The average boy is starting to smoke at 7 years old. And it's because there's this blitz of advertising and easy accessibility here of tobacco. So what we decided to do was to chase down and to say, okay, who owns this company? Who owns this particular company that is making many, many millions of dollars from Indonesia in particular? And what we found is that the largest owners were, in fact, American 529 plans. So for those who don't know what a 529 plan is, it's where you save for your children's college education. And here, I don't mind saying it was the Virginia. Each state has their own 529 plan.
Yeah.
It's the Virginia 529 savings plan. And in fact, the top owners of this particular stock, this tobacco company, out of the top 6, all but one were 529 college savings plans. So think about that for a moment. You have American parents trying to save to give their children a better life and give them a good education, et cetera. And how are they doing that? Well, one of the sources of that are the dividends. So this company pays a very handsome dividend that happens to be coming from putting into a form of bondage these children in Indonesia, right? The irony is tragic here. So that's one example of where somebody in, say, a typical ETF or index fund would be owning this company and profiting from it. And so we said, we don't want to be profiting from these types of stocks and these types of companies. And it is pervasive. I mean, it is absolutely pervasive how much you will find tobacco, abortion, gambling, some of the most addictive behaviors that are out there are being sold in these ETFs, in these mutual funds. And then, as I said, the typical American is profiting from this type of activity. So we find that to be absolutely tragic and something that we ought to turn away from.
Yeah, and also, Curtis, if you don't mind, just a few more, just to add to that. Over the last 100 years, 100 million people have died from tobacco use. And it's expected that 1 billion people will die from tobacco use in the next 100 years. So one thing to remember is that as an investor, you're rooting for the success of the thing you invest in. You want to see this thing proliferate so that your profits, your dividends will keep growing. So one of the questions we should be asking as investors is the question of what are we rooting for in the world? Should it be for more tobacco in the world or for something else?
Those are very stark examples. I mean, the idea that American Christians are funding their own kids' future well-being by plundering essentially the well-being from a 7-year-old child in Indonesia is quite sobering. That's a great example. Finny, do you have another one? Because you brought up the prostitution, which is a very rhetorically strong move there. I think most Christians would be like, okay, I can see it in tobacco, but prostitution, I am not investing in prostitution. Gambling, okay. I mean, I think people can realize, I hope people will realize how huge the gambling industry is and how much it is funded by investments that you are making in just by investing in the S&P 500, because these gambling companies are all part of the S&P 500. But just, can you make the case on prostitution? Because I've never heard that case made before.
Yeah. There's a great article that has been written that I like to share with folks about how what currently right now is happening. There's a lot of awareness with sex trafficking and forms of prostitution that involve minors or people who are brought from other countries. But what a lot of people miss is what fuels that. And the particular article basically says that the fuel, the engine of the sex trafficking industry is pornography. And pornography is what gets people slowly but surely hooked into more and more perverse forms of sexual deviancy. And ultimately, that can take people into really dark and sick places with respect to the kinds of preferences that they end up indulging in. And so we would say that one of the most powerful things that we ought to be doing, and I still think this is one of the leading issues that is just crippling, especially young men, but even young women,
absolutely,
all over the country, all over the world, is this addiction to pornography. And a lot of us don't realize that so much of this comes in these publicly traded vehicles, and they come from companies that are selling all sorts of of pornography in different forms that you end up profiting from. If someone is angry at sex trafficking, which you should be, if someone is angry at the phenomenon of prostitution, let's go to the root, and let's go to say, let's get people to the point where they're not even getting into this kind of behaviors and these sorts of problems. And we certainly don't want to be funding that and patronizing that and profiting from that. So that would be another whole category of activities. There's others we could talk about. I'll maybe just throw in a couple without elaborating as much on them. But abortion is still a major issue. That's something that we as staunch pro-lifers, we feel is another area of just blindness to. There's a lot of people that are pro-life, but then ironically in their own portfolios, they're profiting from abortion. Another area that is one that we have been doing a lot of work on recently is, and I say recently, the last few years, is what's going on with the Uyghur people who live in the northwest of China. So as it turns out, there's this very sad genocide of an ethnic group that's primarily Muslim. And what's happening right now is they're put in these labor camps, basically for forced labor. And there's businesses that are profiting from the activities of these Uyghur people. It's a terrible situation there. And so we've been engaging with portfolio companies and non-portfolio companies to say, you know what, let's look at your supply chain and let's ask, are you actually supporting these labor camps? Are you profiting from these labor camps? And consistently, one of the things that we hear from companies, from CEOs, from CFOs, from heads of supply chains is they say, most people don't even want to ask the questions.
Yeah.
And the fact that you as investors are pressing us on this, we haven't been pressed and we haven't been challenged on this. And we want to make the world rejoice. We want to make the Uyghurs rejoice that Christians are thoughtful enough to say, let's look at our portfolios and ask our companies not to support these kinds of practices. When we say the world rejoice, we want literally the whole world to rejoice, irrespective of ethnicity, of gender, of religion. This is another huge area that we feel like if we could get collectively the Christian community mobilized around this, then we could have significant leverage to topple some of these practices. And that would be something that you can be sure that the Uyghurs and many others would be thrilled to know, as opposed to just watching something on the news and saying, oh, that's sad, and doing nothing about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to just underline just how pervasive these tentacles are that we end up with our own investments just funding. So you brought up the connection between pornography with actual sexual abuse and violence and so forth. And again, most people think, well, I'm not investing in that. Well, if you follow the work of Lila Mickelwaite and her work with the Justice Defense Fund, she's really traced how much, first of all, pornography is a massive, massive business, and all sorts of businesses are making money off of that business, including credit card companies, because that's how these online pornography distributors actually conduct their commerce. And it turns out Visa, MasterCard collect huge fees from the very business of pornography. And almost all of us, find our financial lives entangled and sometimes investing in these large financial companies or internet companies who's providing the bandwidth for the delivery of all of this pornography. I mean, we could go on. You mentioned about supply chain, and I've just recently been doing some reading and just shocked to discover how much of sort of international corporations, American corporations' supply chain is based, either on the kind of slave labor in abroad, like the Uyghurs, or domestically through the use of prison labor and the use of essentially people held captive to produce low-cost goods. So when you do this kind of work and then you like throw in the environment and environmental exploitation, I think if I channel myself as the average listener, I'm like, okay, all right, I get it. I make the case, but it just feels overwhelming. It just feels like it's everywhere. Come on. Like, how could I possibly have clean hands here? The world is corrupt. It is fallen. We can't avoid getting entangled in any of this. Robin, what would you say to that kind of response of somebody who's just throwing their hands up and saying, all right, I see what you're saying, but just be realistic. We can't have clean hands in a fallen world.
Yeah, it is a difficult work to do, and that's why we are seeking to do this work. And so, yeah, for the average everyday person to look through, every single company and what they're involved with and the ethics behind it, and it's a lot of work. So we have a dedicated team at Eventide called the Business 360 team, whose full-time job is to do this. And we get lots of data from various vendors that help us to understand ethics and values that we are driving forward through our investments. So for us, we really do believe that that we have a process by which we're able to find the companies that are not involved in these things and really lean into the companies that are creating compelling value. So Finny mentioned the abortion example. Just on the abortion example, when you factor Planned Parenthood services, in our system, 219 companies out of the Russell 3000 get flagged. So just to use an example, the everyday person just can't do that. It's a lot of work to do that research.
Yeah.
And so the key is to find a good financial advisor that really understands your values and let them understand your values so that they can reflect those values in your investments.
Well, this is why I really keep coming back to a theme here on the Good Faith podcast, which is that our image-bearing calling as human beings does need to take an institutional form, that we bear God's image, not just as individuals, but also as institutions. And the reason is what we've been talking about, that the deformation of our human image bearing happens through institutions. I mean, happens through a complex web of institutions. It's not just the individual pimp on the street that is causing prostitution. There's a whole complex of institutions that are kind of opaque and hard to track, all of the different institutional tentacles that's in place. So if sin has deformed us via fallen human institutions, it just follows that God's redemptive work in the world also has to take the form of institutions. And this is why I'm so glad and I'm so eager to promote Eventide, because to me it's an example of Christians building an institution that is trying to restore the image of God, that in an institutional form, because fallenness and sin is institutional, redemption therefore also has to be institutional. Finny, tell me about that institutional lens. How do you guys apply an institutional lens to when you're thinking about investing? Are you trying to invest in institutions that are actually kind of leaning into the redemptive edge of the world? How does that? I guess we're moving into the embrace part of your investment thesis here, right?
Yeah. Let me first highlight something you said, because it's a message that I think we're still scratching the surface of, which is I sometimes use the language of there's two philosophical approaches that we can take to the world. So there's an individualistic lens that we can take to the world, and there's a structuralist way that we can look at the world. And so an individualist perspective would say it's your choices, it's my choices that we can make in order to change the world positively or negatively. And there's certainly a lot of truth to that. And certainly in the United States, we love individuals. We love the power of the individual, going back all the way into especially 1800s, with that type of thinking is something that really enamors us. But the reality is that so much of who you are, so much of who I am, has been determined by your environment, the schools you went to, your parents, the country you were raised in. There's so many factors that shape you in ways that we can hardly even understand.
Yeah.
And the structuralist perspective is incredibly helpful, even when Jesus looks at the crowds in Matthew 9. He looks at them with compassion because they're like sheep without a shepherd. He doesn't look at them and wag his finger and say, "You bad people, for sinning and not recognizing me." He recognizes that instead they are the product of, in this case, the system of teaching that they were under, and the religious leaders in particular. the institution, if you will, that they were a part of is where Jesus puts the blame. And
Yep.
for that reason, he's able to have compassion on them. And so I think I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but I'll tie this into investing.
Hey, if you're talking about institutional thinking, you're on topic here at the Good Faith. So
all right.
we are institutional beings. We need to think institutionally. God thinks and acts institutionally in the world. So I'm with you 100%, Finny.
Yeah, well, that's good. And I think it actually helps enable us to, number one, have compassion more for
That's
people
right.
Instead of just saying you're a terrible person because you're homeless or whatever it is, even subconsciously. But to realize, you know what, they probably are the result of largely, not entirely, but largely the structural forces that have been at work in their lives. Maybe they came from a broken home, who knows there. So that's one incredibly important element. But two, it gives us a more rational and hopeful strategy to change the world. If we're simply thinking that hearing a good sermon is going to change the world, and I love sermons, and I give sermons, and I appreciate sermons, and they have great value, but they're only a small piece of the puzzle. That what we need to be doing is thinking much more about, Paul would say, the principalities and the powers, and
that's right,
the arche and the exousia. These are the real forces. And, you know, there was nothing like the kinds of power that exists today in business in the first century. I mean, there was the typical business in the first century would have been a farm, or maybe a large farm with dozens, maybe hundreds of slaves there. But the kind of power, and really multinational power, that is wielded by the modern day corporation is unprecedented. And we're not anti-business. We believe that business has a high calling, but it can also be misdirected and unfortunately promoting what harms us as opposed to what helps us. So yeah, I think that is a really important dimension here to what we're talking about, is first understanding why investing matters, is because it is tackling the level of these institutions and these corporations and these structures that a lot of us, frankly, especially in America, can kind of yawn at and think, what's the point? Like, why does this matter? As opposed to saying this really matters because these are so formative. This gets back to what I talked about earlier. There's that direction of influence that comes not just from us to the company, but the company to us. And this is where we really want to be pressing in and saying, how can we think deeply about this? Now, you had asked a question about redemption and how to think about that. Now, we are investing in companies that are often not explicitly Christian or faith-based companies. Mm-hmm. Many of these are, say, small companies in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that are developing a new treatment for ovarian cancer. Okay, and it may be a very mixed group of people in terms of faith and background there, and that's okay. What we're trying to do here is to state with our actions that even though not necessarily the CEOs of our companies may not be Christian, but it is still possible for us to say what this company is doing is it's promoting the global common good. And it's a long-standing tradition in Christianity to recognize that there's the redemptive good and there's the common good, and they actually support one another. So in other words, if you have a situation or a setup where you have someone who is in some kind of bondage, some sort of difficulty in terms of an addiction or some kind of state that is not good with respect to their own common good, well, it is going to be all the more difficult for that person to respond to the redemptive good. So if we go back to that example of pornography, and probably a lot of us have seen this many times, if somebody is in addiction and bondage to pornography, it's going to be really difficult for them to escape that in order to be captivated by the beauty of Jesus. And instead they're chasing these false beauties. And so we would say that the common good is an incredibly important platform to support the redemptive good. And in fact, I would make the case that unless Christians have a strong platform of the common good, it's almost hard for people to hear the message of the redemptive good. So in Matthew 5, when Jesus talks about to the disciples, and he says, you're the light of the world, an amazing statement there. And he says, you're a city on a hill, And he says he wants the world to see your good works, the Christian's good works, and praise the Father in heaven. And so what is that? Why would someone in the world see a good work and praise the Father in heaven? It's probably not because they're seeing that person evangelize. I mean, it's probably unlikely that someone who's outside of the church is praising the Father in heaven over that. It's possible, but I think what's more likely is that the invitation and that force that draws a person in to at least be able to offer up some sort of maybe preliminary or early form of general praise to the Father is because of the good works that we ought to be doing with respect to caring for the world, caring for the poor, advancing all the many causes that we really believe in, and not turning a blind eye to the many problems of the world. We know very well that one of the things that has captivated, especially, let's say, the under 40 or under 30 generation is a sense of purpose and a sense of like, wow, I'm more excited about nonprofit X or organization Y as opposed to the church, because the church can seem irrelevant, because it can seem like it's a bunch of people singing hymns and having lemonade and cookies afterward, like whatever, who cares about that? If people believed that one of the facets that it was to be a Christian, not the entirety, but one of the facets was to be devoted to the common good, as defined as in terms of our biblical understanding there, it would do an immense amount of good to be able to help draw people into that aroma of Christ so that they would be more receptive to the redemptive good.
Talking about does our discipleship under Jesus actually shape our investing practices? And I think we've been making a strong case that it should. But Robin, I want to ask you, but what does that mean though in terms of financial return? Because I'm still needing to save and hopefully reap some higher returns for my retirement, let's say. And you're here saying to me, okay, but you don't want to invest, you want to avoid plunder, you want to embrace good. Is this going to cost me? Is this going to actually mean I'm going to be losing money? How would you respond to that fear of this vision of investing that makes the world rejoice?
Yeah, so my response to that is that generally the answer is no. And I believe that the principles in the Bible, the wisdom principles in the Bible, is not just for the next life, the afterlife, but for this life. That if we follow these principles, that we're actually operating under a framework that God always intended. And that should lead to more success and better results. But that said, obviously there are times where tobacco will outperform the market and we're not investing in tobacco. So there will be periods of time where avoiding ill-gotten gain could lead to underperformance. But generally, because we have the avoid, embrace, engage framework, we do believe that leaning into value creation and the loving neighbor actually leads to better returns long-term. So, for example, companies that have high net promoter scores, these are companies whose customers are raving fans of the products. Those companies generally will have better growth. And there's a book called The Ultimate Question that talks about this. There's another book by Sain Upton called Good Job Strategy that shows that companies that treat their employees well generally have better returns and better growth rates. So we do believe that companies that are creating compelling value for their stakeholders should have better returns in the long term. If you look at Eventide's history, again, I have to be very careful from just a compliance perspective, but you could go to morningstar.com and look at our products and see how we have done over the long term.
And it sounds like, speaking as an investor, you guys have done well. And so let's break that down. What would be examples of what you guys have invested in that follow this avoid, embrace, engage framework? How has that dictated your particular investment strategy? Finny, one of the things, I don't know if I can say this. We'll edit out if I'm in violation here. But I know when I looked at the portfolio of companies that I was investing in through Eventide, and again, just to recap, I think one thing that's emerging from this is it is very difficult, one, to just even do the avoid thing by yourself because because of the institutional complexity of this world. Then when you add on to this, I want to actually find companies that embrace and engage the world in the way that is consistent with my discipleship as a follower of Jesus. That again, I can't, I'm a decently well-read person. I can't do that. I don't have time to do that. This is why I personally invested in Eventide. And but I did do a little more diligence, like, well, what's Eventide investing in? I did notice that there was a lot of companies in biotech, in bio research. Finny, why did Eventide go down that path? Tell me the story there and how that fits with everything we've been talking about.
Sure. I'm a physician by training. I no longer am practicing, but I did a residency and a fellowship at a couple of Boston hospitals here, the Children's Hospital Boston and Brigham and Women's Hospital, and so I've spent, of course, a lot of time in the medical world. And one of the things that I have come to believe very firmly is that we as Christians ought to be extremely positive and known for promoting causes that are especially difficult, or the ways that we ought to be investing should be directed at ways that are promoting human health more globally. So I'll give you a couple of examples here to illustrate this. And I have a much longer version of this that maybe at some point I can share. But I'm very impacted. I was very personally impacted by the work of Ralph Winter, the late Ralph Winter, who was the president of the U.S. Center for World Missions in Pasadena. It's actually where I went to college. And he used to talk about how one of the effects of the fall is structural. And he used to say that if we could get it in our brains that one of the things that happened at the fall was the introduction of disease, was the introduction of pain and suffering. And when Jesus comes, of course, he reverses that. And it says in 1 John that the Son of Man appeared to destroy the works of the devil. And so when he is coming to the earth and he is healing the person with leprosy, or healing the person who's crippled, or healing the blind person, what he's doing is actually rolling back in microcosm, but he's rolling back there the effects of the fall. And so this is an area that we should be very excited about, because we believe that Christians should all believe that part of what the kingdom means in its final expression, and admittedly there's a long, messy journey to get there, but is wholeness. And the extent to which we can bring aspects of healing and wholeness into the present, they ought to be just ways that we are very laudably sending our capital to companies that are doing that. And so, when I think about what are the true unmet needs in the world, and again, this gets back to what I was saying before, is that every investment decision is an expression of values. So does the world need another sports betting app? Is that really where the unmet need of the world lies today? I think most people would say probably not. But what about with respect to some of the most difficult diseases that are out there? So I think of diabetes, I think of cancer, I think of autoimmune diseases. There are opioid addiction. That's another one. I mean, these are very much conditions that have come to us sometimes just by virtue of genetics or some kind of mutation, but sometimes in the case of opioid addiction, a lot of that is structural, again, getting back to what we were saying. And so, we think about how cruel it is to see somebody who was brought into an opioid addiction because of, say, their school environment or somebody who introduced this to them. And then we tell them, okay, now lift yourself up by your bootstraps in order to get out of that, where we're talking about, very, very deep chemical processes that are now really taking over their bodies in ways that, again, we didn't have to deal with, say, 2,000 years ago. So I think healthcare is one of the most exciting areas that Christians ought to be investing in. That's at a high level. There's other more temporal reasons why. with the human genome being sequenced. There's been just an avalanche of insights that have occurred in the last 20 years, especially. There's new technologies, new modalities that have been released. I know you were a part of raising awareness on the vaccines. The vaccines saved millions of lives, and that came as a result of new technology involving these mRNA vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna, other companies like that. I mean, hopefully now people are all the more aware, even say compared to pre-pandemic years, about how powerful this industry really can be when it's at its best. And we are still scratching the surface of what disease really is. I remember when I was starting medical school, I was interviewing at UCSF, and one of the interviewers, a professor there, told me, he said, Finny, do you realize that today, so this was in 1994, but in 1994 years, that today we don't know what the cause is of type 2 diabetes. We don't know really what the cause is of most cancer. We really don't know what the cause is of most autoimmune disease. And he was right. And here we are now in 2023, and we've gotten better, certainly, but we have a long way to go. And imagine a world where Christians were known for addressing this problem. And I'll also say addressing the access and pricing problem as well. This is another area that's more on the engaged side for us. But this ought to be a huge area for us where we can show the world what it is to more responsibly allocate our capital.
Robin, you said earlier that because when we follow God's design for the world, that really should lead to flourishing for the companies that are aligning themselves, at least if not explicitly, at least in their practices with God's design for the world, that they should tend to flourish. And therefore, people who invest in those companies should be flourishing along with them. That sounds great. But there's another aspect of the gospel that sort of stands in the way, which is the cross. That the picture of discipleship does also involve a sacrifice, does involve actually laying down our lives and laying down the maximization of our lives and financial returns. To what extent does the cross actually figure in the practice of investing then? Is there some sacrifice? Or is this just like, hey, you can have the best of both worlds? Or how do we think about the cross and investing, Robin?
Yeah, when we were starting Eventide, for Finny and me and the others that were in that prayer that I mentioned, that was really a part of our conversation then. Mm-hmm. And, for us, it was really about seeking to honor God, to love God, and to be faithful, even if it meant a cost. And initially, we were even praying over various like nonprofit type ideas. But whatever we did, we wanted to make sure that we were totally faithful. And ultimately, when I do talk to people, I remind them that sometimes people are debating over 0.5 basis point or something, or 0.5%. And I'm saying, there are Christians that are making real sacrifices for the gospel in order to be faithful to God, going into parts of the world that are dangerous and taking their children and their families there. And sometimes, it does bother me that we are debating over 0.5% or something like that, right? And those debates sometimes happen when people look at like index funds that are kind of screened based on certain values versus how the index is doing. Over the long period, there's no evidence of underperformance or outperformance. But in short-term periods, it could be either way. Yeah. And so those conversations do tend to happen a lot. And, my own feedback is as Christians, like we should be willing and ready to make the necessary sacrifices. Like in Proverbs 1, verses 10 to 19, it says, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not go along with them. If they say, 'Come along with us, let's plunder and let's share a purse,' don't do that." King David is another example. King David, he was in the cave of Adullam, and the Bible says that he was so thirsty, and his mighty men overhear from him that he wants water from a certain well in Bethlehem. His mighty men put their lives at risk. They go through the Philistine army, and they get the water, and they bring it back to David. Even then, David makes a sacrifice. David says, "I cannot drink the blood of my men. I can't imagine that his men would actually give him blood to drink. But he sees blood because he knows the risk that his men took. So even if it means that we as Christians have to make sacrifices and there is underperformance, I do believe this is what God would expect of us.
Great. We're back with Finny Kuruvilla and Robin John, who I would say are a combination of, Warren Buffett and Billy Graham in their, these guys are investment managers who know their Bible and are sharing a lot of biblical wisdom with us today on what does it mean for Christians to be investing in a way that reflects Jesus. So I want to shift the conversation to a little more personal note. What I have found is, well, first of all, what you guys are doing is so distinctive and interesting, and I would call it a prophetic sort of sign to the world that we can invest, we can act institutionally, we can build institutionally different. It's really distinctive. Whenever I find something distinctive, I always feel like for God to have brought this in the world through these guys, God must have been preparing them for this for a long time. So I want to ask that question, Finny. How does your life, when you think about your full sort of story of your life from even back, started back as far as you want to your childhood, how have you just seen God preparing you for this redemptive work?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I was born in Southern California. My parents came from India, both from South India. And I was very inspired by them as they had the maybe more typical immigrant path of rags to riches, came here with basically nothing and worked hard, saved, and got ourselves into more of a stable place financially. And then in the 1980s, my dad, who was working for World Vision, which is a Christian humanitarian organization, he decided to quit his job so that he could go back to India to do church planting, and ultimately started a Bible school in North India. And so that example to me was very powerful, that expressed that, hey, it's not about wealth, it's not about comfort, it's about doing what God calls you to do and making sacrifice in order to see the gospel advance in whatever ways that you possibly can. And so I have been very, very inspired by their example. My parents, who are about to cross 50 years of marriage just in a couple weeks, have been huge inspirations to me along the way. And I would say it was them, number one, and then my true favorite hobby is just reading. I love to read books, and I feel like I've been discipled primarily through reading high quality books, particularly older Christian books. And it's the convergence of those forces that took my love of science, my love of medicine, and said, all right, well, what can I do to take my passion for medicine and my love of science into something more entrepreneurial to ultimately see the kingdom advance more robustly. And so when we started Eventide, we decided that we were going to have a significant portion of what we generated as profits, go back into funding Christian work in particular. We're very proud of that, and it's been a huge part of what gets us excited about what we do, is not just the actual work of investing, but it's seeing the profits go to causes that we're really excited about and passionate about.
That's a lovely story. And by the way, for anybody who wants to check out Eventide, look up the bios of both of these guys. And I'm thinking about Finny, just the amount of education, your love of education is reflected in the number of degrees you have from different institutions. Encourage you guys to check that out. And I think that you'll understand a little bit about why Eventide's investment thesis gets played out in things like biotech, and medicine. Finney's sort of God's prepared Finney for that, to understand that world through his education. Robin, how would you answer that question? How has God's work in your whole life prepared you for this work?
Yeah, I was born in a village in southern India, and I have just, I would say, seen God working in my family in various ways. And, I grew up with a grandfather who was a pastor, church planter, learning the Bible in Malayalam, a Southern Indian language, at a young age. So I was very blessed in that way. And I think growing up, I would pray that God would call me into the ministry. And even in college, I would pray that way. And later, when I took a job at a bank, they asked me whether I wanted to go back to India to help with outsourcing. And it was through that experience, more and more, I started feeling dissatisfied. I saw, for example, how the housekeeper and the cook at the guest house were being treated. They didn't even have a bed to sleep on. They were sleeping on the floor behind the kitchen in a pantry, while the rest of us had beautiful beds, air conditioners in our rooms. Really started to bother me. And I thought to myself, it seems like business is just about profit. I want to go into charitable type ministry, church ministry. And I would pray that way. And ultimately, I left that job, lost another job. That got me in my parents' basement, late nights, kneeling by the washing machine and dryer, and just crying before God and asking God to show me what to do. Whatever God would want me to do, I wanted that to be clear. And I would pray late nights. And then I asked Finny to pray with me. And that's how that 6 months of prayer and where we would fast once a week started. And ultimately, I felt that God was leading us into investing. And a lot of it had to do with just things I learned from Finny along the way over the years. Things that Finny would say about investing and not profiting from ill-gotten gain, and seeing a huge need in the marketplace, with especially Christians really not understanding what their investments were doing in the world. And we saw a need and an opportunity that we thought we could meet. Finney, given his investing background, and myself, given my operations background, working at a large custody bank. And so God ultimately blessed the work. We started, without a lot of experience, really submitted a lot of, all of it to God, really. And just, I think God opened doors and shut doors and just helped us along the way.
It's a beautiful story. And boy, at some point we'll have you guys back on because I want to hear more about your friendship with each other, because it seems like what has sustained Eventide is this partnership and this friendship
Well, I
over
would
the
say even more
years.
than that is, I would
Yeah.
say mentorship. I think Finney's been not just for me, but for young people, young men in Boston, but across the country, just an example of a Christian. So it's been a blessing for me.
All right, Finney, you've just got touted as a mentor here. I want to invite you to mentor our audience for just a few minutes. If you're you're speaking to tens of thousands of listeners who are like, oh, this sounds, I can imagine them thinking this sounds inspiring, convicting, also overwhelming. How do I even get started? So, Finney, if you were to just mentor them for a moment, how do they take the first steps as your average Christian with money to invest? What should they be doing?
Yeah, there's a lot of scriptures on the topic of money in the Bible, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard that Jesus spoke about money as much or more than he spoke about any other topic. And so that ought to let us know that there's a tremendous danger and seduction of mammon. It's always struck me whenever I've thought about this passage where Jesus says you cannot serve God and mammon. He doesn't say God and Satan. He says God and mammon in Matthew chapter 6. And so we need to be aware of how seductive mammon is. It really is a power in its own right. And there's a few ways that we can help break the stranglehold of mammon on our lives. Of course, we all have to use money in some way, and it's not something that we want to run into the forest and the hills and try to subsist off of the land. We think that money can be used for good purposes. But I would say looking at the dimensions of spending, giving, and investing are the three headlines I think that it's good for us to consider. And so with respect to spending, this is something that both Robin and I have experience with coming from backgrounds where money was not always abundant, that it's something that we need to remember how most people live, and to live in ways as best we can to press into a lifestyle of simplicity. One of the passages when I was in InterVarsity in college that made a huge impact on me was when John the Baptist was speaking to people, and he's giving them counsel about what repentance looks like. And he says, "You who have 2 tunics should give to the one who has none." And that just blew me away, because I opened my closet and I saw a lot more than 2 tunics than 2 coats. And so I decided to radically simplify my own life and to try to live in as simple a way as possible. And I realize there's dangers with legalism and all that, but nonetheless, it's more common that people, for fear of legalism, do too little than they press into that life of simplicity and how we ought to live, particularly a life where we can have people in our homes, in our cars, and have a sense of like, okay, we don't have to feel sheepish or embarrassed.
But Finny, give me an example of how you're a MD, PhD, from Harvard, from a number of very MIT prestigious degrees. You could be making a lot of money. You are in the investment world. A lot of money is flowing through you. How do you practice simplicity given all of this money that you're and resources and privilege and power that's flowing through you? What does simplicity mean for you in that context?
Yeah, it gets to a lot of brass tacks about the clothes I wear, the car I drive, the house I live in, and I try as best as I can to live blue collar, simple as much as I can. People sometimes have a joke about this in the office. The jacket that I'm wearing is the jacket I got during my med school interviews in 1994. So
still fits you very well. You look great,
well,
Finny.
Thank you. Almost 30 years of use here. So hopefully you can get another 10 to 20 out of them. Cars, how, we ought to just like ask ourselves the question, like what would it look like for us to live in such a way where, again, somebody coming in who's poor, who's struggling, they're gonna feel a sense of not distance between you and them, but a sense of connection. And I think it's going to look different for different people, and I wouldn't prescribe any one dollar amount or specific set of parameters there. But I think C.S. Lewis was the one who said it well, where he said, "I can't tell you what dollar amount to give, but I can tell you give more than you can afford." So you're feeling it, and there's a sense in which like, I wish I could do X, Y, and Z, but because I've decided to live a more simple life, I'm not going to do that. Giving would be the second element in this, is being generous with our giving. And there's all kinds of stats that you've probably talked about on your show before about how little we give, even though we're the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And if we could mobilize our giving to the kinds of causes that advance the kingdom, it would do an amazing wonder for the world. And then the third, and this is the one that Eventide is trying to elevate the conscience of the West, especially, is to ask about, well, what does it mean to invest, and what does it look like to be faithful in our investing? And we have to be really careful here. And again, we could talk for a long time about specific practices where investing shouldn't be about building bigger barns, and it's easy for people to fall into that. So maybe that's a topic for another conversation. But in the practice of investing, let it be the case that we are profiting from companies and businesses that we feel are compatible with the global common good and with biblical values. And we can use different tests there. We've used tests like, would I be proud to tell my friends that my son or daughter worked there? If we can't say that, and maybe that's a little bit of a check for us. So we want our revenues, our source of income from the investing side, to be something that's compatible with biblical values, and then also appropriately sized for the kinds of objectives that are also compatible with the Bible. Again, that's a whole topic in and of itself. So I would say those three dimensions, spending, giving, and investing, would be the ones that I would say each requires discipleship. And frankly, in 2023 in the West, especially in America, it requires way more discipleship than most of us probably even think we need, because it's just, again, such an area of blindness that collectively we all have.
All right. Well, I'm so encouraged by your model. Robin, I want to ask you one final question, which is, as you guys pursue this vision, it can feel like you are going against such massive institutional powers of mammon, to use Finney's biblical reference there. I want to ask you, Robin, to close us with, like, what personal practice sustains your sense of hope?
Yeah, for me, there's a few. First of all, at Eventide, when Finney and I started Eventide, we wrote right into the operating agreement of the company that well over half of our profits, we would not even see it. So it goes into donor advised funds or private foundations. Then hopefully we would be very generous with the money that also comes into our bank accounts. One of the practices I have is just going to other parts of the world and spending time with the real poor. I was able to co-found a school in India for young women. And one of the practices I have is just going into their homes and spending time with their parents and talking to them. And these are just very difficult lives that people live. During my recent trip, a father found out that I was supporting. At first, the father thought I was a teacher. He just fell at my feet in front of like 4 of his daughters. And I couldn't believe it. Just spending time with people that really are suffering and knowing that God is using you for a purpose is not just about yourself. As Finney said, investing shouldn't be about greed. Investing should have a greater purpose for the world, not just for yourself. The story of the world is invest for your retirement so you can live a comfortable life. That is not what Eventide wants to promote. And I think for me, just spending time with people that are struggling and suffering in many ways, taking those trips, visiting those homes really helps me. Sometimes, like, even our giving could feel so distant when we're just giving through some large nonprofit, but actually going and spending time with the people that are benefiting from the giving really has a big impact on me.
Well, guys, thank you so much. Finny Kuruvilla, Rob and John, founders of Eventide Investments. I hope you guys listening at least check it out, or check out like-minded institutions who are trying to promote a vision of investing that for them is converging our commitment to follow Jesus with where we send our dollars. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. We will once again next week continue our common work here of trying to make sense of the world, and we will do so together as friends following Jesus. And so once again next week, join us as we gather around the campfire.